Good afternoon, everybody. My pleasure to have the opportunity to interview John Fallon, the CEO of Pearson. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Obviously, Pearson, the gorilla in the education space, but the gorilla's been very nimble in terms of what it's been doing under John's leadership. And so if somebody hasn't paid close attention, I think they'd be surprised at kind of the transformation of the business. Maybe you could give a little update just in terms of some of the key strategic activities that you've done over the last 5 years or so.
Well, first of all, Michael, I'm interviewing Tony Blair later this evening, so I'm hoping I'm going to pick up some tips from you on interviewing techniques in the next 25 minutes or so. So I suppose we frame this a tale of two disruptions, which sort of gives you a little bit of the sense of it. And those of you who are, I could recognize some people in the audience who are former Pearson employees, a little bit of a clumsy joke here, because we used to talk a lot about, the reference to The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. You all know the introductory paragraph, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was a time of light and a time of darkness, a time of joy and a time of fear. And that's pretty much what has required us to be so nimble in Pearson over the last 5 years. And I think one of the things I've learned is disruptions are actually neither good or bad innately. It's what you do with them that defines them. And it's not predestined or preordained that you're going to be a disruptor or disrupted. That's your choice to make in terms of how you respond. And to give sort of two examples of the scale of the change, the first I'd give is the $300 college textbook is dead. You can now rent many ebooks from Pearson for less than $30. You can have a ebook with a MyLab or a mastering, which is deeply immersive learning, hugely important to getting your assessment for your particular course, for less than $90. And the reason we're able to charge those sorts of prices, such a big transformation, and still have a profitable, viable business, is because we're a much simpler, more efficient company. We've taken over $1 billion of costs out of the business over the last 5 years. So that's one disruption, but that's the sort of the less interesting one. The more interesting one, I think, is this. I remember sitting in my office in London in 1999, and this very thick, paper-rich, analog book written by a youngish-ish sell-side analyst by the name of Michael Moe was there, and it was called The Book of Knowledge. And it was all about this idea that we lived in, or would be living in, an innately knowledge-driven economy. And in this, not yet, some 20 years before we called it the Fourth Industrial Revolution, our ability to learn how to learn would determine our success in life. And that technology had the power to personalize, transform, and democratize learning on a scale never possible before. And the really exciting thing, I think, for us and for everybody here is sort of 20 years on, I feel we're just in the foothills of delivering on that promise.
I agree.
And so much of the things that we're doing, that perhaps going to talk about, the $1 billion a year of research and development that we're putting into the digital transformation of the business is all about achieving that. So I think that's what has made this an exciting time for us and why we're suddenly feeling very sort of rosy and optimistic and bullish about the future.
Well, and speaking of innovation and R&D, you announced a venture fund. Talk about the strategy there and what you're doing with that.
Well, I think it's a recognition that we need to sort of work much more as part of a wider ecosystem. And that, we've, long through sort of learned capital, taken equity stakes in a lot of early stage ventures, but we want to try and underpin some more strategic relationships. So to give a couple of examples, we see a big opportunity to help our digital curriculum connect teachers, parents, and school students in China. fantastic early stage startup company called NamiBox that we're working with. We've underpinned that relationship by taking a strategic stake in NamiBox. We may want to talk about it in a minute, something I'm hugely excited about, the way we are using AI and reinforcement learning to create what will be our first direct-to-student app around college algebra. We're developing that with a small AI startup in Cambridge, UK. We've underpinned that relationship by taking an equity stake. So it's a sort of an approach whereby we're both investing in earlier stage companies, but underpinning strategic partnerships and relationships that are important to us and to the customers we serve in a different way than perhaps we did in the past. And as you may have noticed, we've had a little break from making big acquisitions, but times will change and there'll be opportunities there again.
Well, talk about that. So at one point, the first call was always to Pearson, right? If you were an education company that was looking for an exit, Pearson was the first call, then kind of stop. What's your view on acquisitions today? Is that going to be something that's going to take more of a priority? I mean, obviously you've had significant transformation of the business.
Yeah, so we had, I think, I don't know if this is the precise number, but we must have made something like at least 50 acquisitions in education over a period of about a decade. And every one of those acquisitions brought with it its own learning management system, its own student identity system, its own way of doing assessment and content and the like. And so there's been a huge amount of work. One of the ways that we've been able to simplify the company and take so many costs out of the business while still delivering good service to our customers is just because there was a lot of work to do to simplify and rationalize. And at the same time, we wanted to shift the focus more to organic investment. We wanted to bet on the innovation and creativity of our own talent, and as importantly, the relationship we've built with our customers and the ability to co-create and co-develop with them. Hence the $1 billion a year of research and development that we've been spending each year. But we're now at a point, you and I were talking this morning, our net debt as a proportion of EBITDA last year was 0.2. So, about sort of $250 million of net debt. If we'd been having this conversation 3 years ago, it was over $3 billion. So clearly we have the capacity if we choose to use it, but it would always be against the measure of how can we do this organically? Can we do this in partnership? How can we work with others? How can we build this broader ecosystem? But clearly there is an opportunity there that we can use at some point that it makes sense to do so.
Well, you talk about $1 billion. These numbers is it's pretty staggering. $1 billion of cost you've taken out of the business in 5 years. You're investing $1 billion a year in research and development. You got a bunch of new initiatives. You've got a lot of capacity. How do you think about growing the business? What are it looks like Pearson's positioned to be a real growth business.
And that's again the two disruptions, because we have the capacity to grow very strong, but we've also had to deal with the analog disruption on the textbook business as we've worked our way through. I think the way that we think about the future of the company is we aspire to having a direct relationship with tens of millions of learners who see Pearson as a partner who can help to guide, support, and steer them through a lifetime of learning and help to relate their educational experiences to what they experience in work and their lives every day. Yeah. That's the goal. We build that on the basis of the fact the world-class capabilities that we have in content assessment, digital capabilities that we're building. To give you an example, we'll launch our first products this year on the global learning platform. What this does is it enables us to ingest any content, whether that's created by Pearson or any of our partners or customers, and render it in a truly mobile-first way, which gives an absolutely fantastic learner experience, which I think is really important because most learning technology today is still actually sort of laptop-based rather than truly mobile-first, data-rich, highly secure, enables us to build that direct relationship with millions of learners and dramatically transforms the pace of innovation and our ability to, as I say, co-create, co-develop, try things out, work out what works, use all what we've learned around efficacy over the last 7 years. What's the learning outcome? How's it going to be better? What's the evidence that supports it? Bang, and go. After all the hard stuff that we've had to do over the last 5 years, the thought that we can now be so sort of ambitious and progressive is a fantastic place to be.
Yeah, one of the mega trends that we talked about looking at the next 10 years is this platform concept. And I think the opportunity with that in terms of a value proposition and learning efficacy could be gigantic. And the data that you're going to have should be very, very powerful.
Yeah, I still think, I mean, and I see former colleague Bill Bark sat in the front row. I still think that one of the most commercially proven and scalable digital learning applications over the last 10 years was taking those end of chapter questions in the textbooks and using them to automate the setting and marking of homework. Yeah. Huge productivity gain for faculty and teachers, huge benefit to students because they got much more immediate feedback. We were only really able to do that for the quantitative disciplines, and there was a limit to how adaptive it could be. I think now what's really exciting, we can take the machine learning capabilities that we've used over many years in our high stakes assessment businesses and apply them in lower stakes. So to give you a couple of examples, we're working on a major pilot that we should have in market next year, which essentially uses AI and reinforcement learning to help a teacher mark essays much more effectively. So essentially, the teacher assigns the essay, maybe 100 students submit it online, the teacher marks the first few, and then the machine in the background nudges and says, I can take over from here, and marks those essays, but crucially to the rubric set by the teacher. And at any point, the teacher can go back in and say, well, you've not quite caught that concept the way I would have assessed it, so they can correct that, and then the machine goes back and applies that correction all the way through. Huge productivity gain for faculty. One of the reasons faculty don't often set as much essays as they would like and test some of those skills is it's a lot of work. And I have a 21-year-old daughter of my own, University College London. Her big complaint is, well, I've got to submit my next essay, and I still haven't got the mark back from the previous one. And when I do get it back, it just gives me fairly perfunctory feedback. So I think this is potentially transformational. Another one is in math. I mean, as fantastic as my math lab and other products like that have been, they're still better at saying you got the answer right or wrong. The amount of real adaptivity they can do is relatively early stage. The product I mentioned earlier that we'll have into market this summer is, because the other thing we've learned is still the best way to solve a math problem is to get a piece of paper, write out the problem, and then work it out. So a student can do that. They take their phone out, they take a picture of what they've done, they send it to the machine, and in real time it translates it into text, it marks it for them, and crucially provides them real-time feedback, what they've got right, what they've got wrong. The virtual tutor can pop up and give them a bit of feedback and help. Again, I think this is so sort of exciting and transformational, and a great example of why I say we're still at the foothills of what's possible.
Well, no, I think that is a game changer. I mean, it could be a game changer. Talk about AI more. Where do you think it's overhyped? I mean, that's obviously, every company basically says.
Yeah, and I'm let's be clear. Our product team has sat in San Francisco and Hoboken cringing and saying, John hasn't gone and promised that, because there's a lot, there's still a lot of, between the idea and the reality falls the shadow, and there's still a lot of work to do. We will get there. You've got to have the ambition and the vision. I think what we have learned is, and I think it's changing now with the development of sort of, the way that reinforcement learning is starting to come through, but you can, if you ask the machine to do this, and you train it and you invest the time and effort in the data, it can do it. If you can say to the machine, well, I don't want you to do this, I want you to do, 2 degrees to the right or 2 degrees to the left.
Right.
I still think that is a very challenging thing for machines to do. And I do think the other big issue here is around culture, organizational design. This always has to be about human and machine. This always has to be about the machine in the service of the teacher and the learner, and it's the teacher and the learner that are directing where the machine can help them. I think that is fundamentally important, both in terms of the efficacy, in terms of getting the outcomes that we desire, but also actually just in terms of bringing about the cultural changes that we need to see to actually make that happen.
So when you go back to when you took over as CEO of Pearson, and you're obviously there for a bit before that, and on the board, what's radically different than you expected today than when you took over, and what different and both better and more challenging?
I think there's a couple of things. I think one is we were talking about I was talking about disruption earlier, and I think for any organization, when change and disruption is happening, it's always easier to believe that it's cyclical and structural. I heard a senior executive in the advertising industry talking about some of the challenges they were having and saying, don't worry, it's cyclical, not structural. And I just, because whenever there's something cyclical going on, there's something structural lurking in the shadows. But every fiber and every being of the organization will point to all the data that says this is just a cyclical thing and it's going to go away again, and we'll find every reason to discount the structural stuff. Right. I mean, you can argue that the $300 textbook died a decade ago. It just took the publishing industry 5 years to realize that that's what had happened, and to respond and to get ahead of it. So I think that's one thing. And I think secondly, look, I've spent over 20 years of my life at Pearson. I love the company dearly. It's a fantastic company with a fantastic culture. $1 billion and more of cost doesn't come without, the headcount of the company will have been reduced by the best part of 10,000 people over that time period. We've tried to do it always with, respect and generosity and class and dignity, but, that's not hard. But we are a 175-year-old company. We're never going to be anybody's unicorn.
Right.
But maybe we have learned something along the way about you take your blows, you take your knocks, you sort of learn, you stay close to your customers, you keep investing, you keep true to your vision, and your time will come again. And our time is coming again.
So talk to me about your views on emerging markets. You clearly are making bets there and are excited about it. What are you seeing, and what gets you most excited about these emerging markets for Pearson and maybe overall good?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think one, I caught the end of the previous session around sort of diversity. I think one of the very exciting things in Pearson is, our first wave of entry into emerging markets was quite often led by, people who look like myself, who were sent from head office in London or in New York. And now, we've got, for example, our business in Brazil is not only a really brilliantly run business in its own right, but it's a real generator of talent that is now making its impact felt across the company. So, the next generation of senior executives in Pearson will come not just from, the UK and the US and the like, but it'll come from China, and it'll come from Brazil, and it'll come from India. It's coming from South Africa and places like that. So I think it just adds greatly to the diversity of the company. I think, secondly, a decade ago, if you wanted to play in education in China for a company like us, you really had to get into the direct delivery business. Mm-hmm. that took us out of our comfort zone. That's not really who we are or what we do well. We've now exited, we've sold Wall Street English, we've sold Gedu, which is our test prep business, but we're now much more able to play to our strengths. So our business in China starts to look much more like the business does in the rest of Pearson. The value of our content, combining it with assessment, powered by technology and services, delivering outcomes by working with and through our partners. That's possible in China now in a way it wasn't a few years ago. And what's really interesting is also a real major center of innovation and invention. So the third big AI-inspired initiative we've got going is around English language assessment, and that's actually been done out of China in partnership with the Microsoft Research Institute there and local partners. So I think it becomes much more a source of innovation, and you've seen that. I mean, look at the Chinese presence here.
Yes.
As well. I mean, I think that's really sort of exciting. I think what's yet to happen, I think in both, and Brazil and India are two great, I would say two of the countries in the world where something like online program management, partnering with universities to power high quality online universities, two of the places that could happen and have the biggest impact is Brazil, where they have a strong tradition of distance learning for higher education, but I think one would have to say the quality and the outcomes is still not where it could be. Mm-hmm. And India, where India cannot build enough new physical universities to meet the demand over the next decade. But at the moment, there's regulatory barriers to the take-up of online education, and online is seen as cheap and low quality rather than premium and high quality, and we've got to all work together to transform that. So I think those are a couple of the big opportunities I'd see.
Yeah, no, I think it's all those points are fascinating. It's changing so quickly. Yeah, but that sort of creates opportunity, right? Yeah. Talk more about the platform and how this has come. How you envision this looking 5 years from now, and what if it achieves its potential, what you'll be able to do as it relates to content, efficacy, access?
Well, I think let's take a specific example. So we've obviously are investing very significantly, like others are, in our online program management business, where we partner with universities to launch purely online degree programs. Renewing this week our partnership with ASU to drive ASU online, and incredibly proud to have played at least a supporting role in the incredible vision of Michael and the team in what they've achieved there. And alongside that, I've talked about how we've reinvented college publishing to be a sort of digital courseware business. At the moment, those two businesses still are sort of slightly running in tandem and parallel lines, and I think there's a real opportunity for convergence. There was many things in that Huffington Post piece last week that you could take exception with about the online program industry, but at one point it did make rather well, is that actually the two people profiting most from it at the moment are actually Google and Facebook. And there is if we can, through our platform basis, for the first time go from anonymous to known, to be in a point where there's tens of millions of learners with whom we have a direct relationship, and actually we're also allowing our partners to have a direct relationship with, who we can help to think about, these are your career aspirations, these are your strengths, these are your challenges, here's where you might want to think about next. It can transform that model, and also just think about some of the things we've talked about today could transform the online learning experience and add real value to that. So I think that's where that starts to go. But you and I have learned a lot since the days when we had a bit more hair than we had now. And the one things we know is whatever we say about what will happen in 5 years' time, it ain't going to be quite how we think it is.
That's true.
I mean, that's the,
That's very, very true. Well, in the very short period of time we have left, I want to ask you two questions. One sort of rapid fire, just is a couple different technology points, and then I want to wrap it up with a question. But so blockchain, do you think is blockchain play into your strategic map at all in terms of relevant for Pearson in the short term, intermediate term, or long term?
I think I was actually I had a quick chat with Matt Patinsky of Parchment this morning. I think the area where I could see it having the biggest impact would be the repository for different credentials. As I was talking to Matt, I was thinking, well, how is it going to do it better than a platform like Parchment does it today? But I think that would be the obvious place for it. You know, if we're gathering, you know, credentials and badging and all the different experiences we have, that's where it would be. But to be honest, I've not, you know, I've sat through a couple of sessions at IBM and Microsoft conferences and read a few articles, just enough to be dangerous and not enough really to be able to offer a more informed opinion than that. But I think that's where I'd be looking and thinking about it. What do you share?
I agree. I think that's interesting. I wish we had more. The time goes so fast. I do have one last question. So many people in the audience probably don't know that before John was an executive at Pearson, he was a Politico. And so I'm fascinated what the interview with Tony Blair will be tonight. But what is the one question that you have for him that you're kind of dying to ask him?
Well, then if I tell you that, nobody needs to come to the dinner time. I do think, as a bit of a taster, I do think what I think is interesting. I mean, you know, we'll have the Brexit debate tonight, but I think what is making Brexit so traumatic in Britain is it's the first issue in my lifetime where it doesn't divide along party political lines. This is not a left versus right issue. It's more of an issue of culture and identity. Yeah. And as a society in the UK, and dare I suggest with my accent, society here, finding our way to negotiate through these cultural and identity issues in a way that is respectful and enables us to shuffle around in each other's shoes is probably one of the most urgent things we need to do for the quality of our democracy in our societies.
I agree. Well, this interview went way too quick, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.